As the guns fell silent in 1939, the echoes of the Spanish Civil War resounded far beyond its borders. The lessons at taught ignored or misunderstood would soon play out on a much larger and deadlier stage. For while its internal fire had consumed Spain, the rest of Europe was sliding toward the abyss. The Spanish Civil War had been a prelude, and in many ways, a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. But for the Spanish people, there was no moment of peace, only the start of a different kind of suffering. The 1940s in Spain became known as La Posguerra, the post-war period. It was a time of hunger, darkness, and repression. The country was economically devastated. Infrastructure had been shattered. Entire industries had vanished. The victorious regime did little to rebuild in the early years, instead focusing its efforts on rooting out dissent. Franco's government created the Tribunals de Res. These trials were a grotesque parody of justice. Often based on rumors or anonymous denunciations, they led to imprisonment, fines, forced labor, and prisoners were packed into overcrowded cells. Some were used as slaves to build monuments to Franco's glory, including the vast and eerie Valle de los, the Valley of the Fallen, a massive basilica carved into a mountain, built by political prisoners to honor the dead of the war. The only nationalist dead were officially recognized. Even daily life was defined by fear. The civil guard patrolled the streets, ears always open for whispers of dissent. In villages, a spoken word out of place could bring ruin. People learned to speak cautiously, to nod without expressing opinion, to erase themselves for safety. Entire generations grew up in a climate of silence. Economically, Spain remained trapped in autarky, a policy of national self-sufficiency that led to scarcity, black markets, and widespread poverty. Bread was rationed. Coffee became a luxury. For a time, even paper and soap were hard to find. Women bore the brunt of the burden, expected to raise children, care for broken families, and adhere to a strict code of Catholic virtue. Under Franco, women lost most of their legal rights. They could not open a bank account without their husband's permission. Their place was in the home, under the rule of the cross and the yoke. And yet, even under this suffocating regime, resistance endured. In the mountains of northern Spain, guerrilla bands known as Brigades continued the fight, composed of former Republican fighters, escaped prisoners, and leftist exiles who had returned in secret. These groups hoped to ignite a broader rebellion. They attacked Francois' forces, sabotaged railways, and tried to keep the flame of resistance alive. But they were isolated, outnumbered, and ultimately crushed. By the early 1950s, the last of the Maquis were either dead, imprisoned, or forced back into hiding. In exile, the Republic lived on in memory and spirit. Hundreds of thousands of Spanish refugees had crossed into France in the final months of the war. Many languished in squalid camps. When World War II began, some were recruited into the French resistance or deported to Nazi concentration camps. The Mauthausen camp in Austria came to be known as the Camp of the Spaniards. Others found new lives in Latin America. Mexico, in particular, welcomed Spanish intellectuals, artists, and exiles. The Republican government continued to exist in exile, maintaining diplomatic relations with sympathetic countries, even as hope for a return to democracy dwindled. Back in Spain, the 1950s and 60s brought a strange transformation. The Western powers, once hostile to Franco, now saw him as a necessary ally against the spread of communism. In 1953, Franco signed a deal with the United States allowing American military bases in exchange for economic aid. Suddenly, Spain was no longer a pariah but a partner in the global Cold War struggle. US dollars flowed into the economy. Technocrats were brought into the government. Industry revived. Tourism exploded. For the first time in decades, Spaniards had hope of economic mobility. This period, known as the Spanish Miracle, brought modernization but not freedom. Political parties remained banned. Censorship remained absolute. The security apparatus remained omnipresent. A generation came of age under dictatorship, taught to obey, to conform, and to forget. And yet, the seeds of change were quietly being sown. By the late 1960s, a younger generation raised in silence began to question the myths of the regime. University protests erupted. Workers organized illegal strikes. Intellectuals spoke in code, writing novels and plays that critiqued the regime beneath layers of metaphor. Outside of Spain, the memory of the Civil War was being kept alive through art, literature, and testimony. Films like The Spirit of the Beehive and books like Homage to Catalonia reminded the world of what had happened and what had been lost. Franco grew older, increasingly detached from the changing world. He resisted reform, even as his own ministers began to see the need for transition. In 1969, he named Prince Juan Carlos, grandson of the deposed king, Alfonso XIII, as his successor, expecting him to continue the dictatorship after his death. It was a grave miscalculation. When Franco finally died on November 20, 1975, after a long illness, the country held its breath. Would there be violence? Retaliation? Another war? But Juan Carlos surprised the world. Rather than cementing authoritarian rule, he initiated a transition to democracy. Political parties were legalized. Political prisoners were released. In 1978, Spain adopted a new constitution, establishing a parliamentary monarchy and guaranteeing civil liberties. It was one of the most remarkable peaceful transitions of the 20th century. But peace did not mean closure. The memory of the Civil War remained contested. In the rush to democratize, many atrocities were left unaddressed. The 1977 amnesty law protected former regime officials from prosecution. It also discouraged public discussion of the war. Spain entered a pact of forgetting, a decision to look forward, not back. And yet, forgetting proved impossible. In the 21st century, demands for historical justice returned. Survivors, descendants, and historians began to speak louder. They sought to identify the mass graves scattered across the country. They demanded recognition for the victims. Their Asociación para la Recuperación de la Memoria Histórica was founded to document the disappeared and excavated truth. In 2007, the Historical Memory Law attempted to provide state support for these efforts. Streets named after Francois figures were renamed. Monuments were removed. Public archives were opened. Still, the scars remain visible. Spanish society continues to wrestle with the legacy of the Civil War. Political polarization flares when the past is invoked. Debates over Franco's exhumation, over education, over memory, reveal just how raw the wounds still are. And yet, the story of the Spanish Civil War is not just a Spanish story. It is a universal one. It is the story of what happens when democracy is dismantled not in a single blow, but in small, deliberate steps. When institutions falter, when hatred replaces dialogue, when violence becomes normalized, it is a warning of what civil war truly means. Not just armies and battles, but broken families, shattered communities, and generations living in silence. And it is a testament to resilience. To the poets who wrote in exile, to the mothers who searched for their children's remains, to the teachers who dared to speak truth in their classrooms, to a nation that endured dictatorship and chose democracy. The Spanish Civil War is not history to be forgotten. It is history to be learned, mourned, and remembered. Only through remembrance can the silence be broken. Only through truth can the dead finally rest. And only through understanding can we ensure that the horrors of civil war remain in the past, never to return.